Welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series. We're at the 4th of October already, getting quite late in the year. Today's session is about student self-assessment by Danny Carroll from the University of New South Wales Business School. So Danny, would you like to begin, please?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm just going to do video for the first minute or so and then go to the slides. So yeah, my name is Dan Carroll. I'm a digital learning specialist at the University of New South Wales Business School. The talk I'm going to give today really is about data from my thesis, which is on student self-assessment accuracy. It's a quantitative study mostly, but I promise to make it interesting and not go on too much about t-values and p-values. I'm going to try and frame it in relation of self-assessment's real-world utility. So I've called it rationale and practice, so the reasons why we do self-assessment, and then details about what I've observed in my study. So I do hope you find it interesting. We've got an hour, so relax in. I'll try and take about 40-45 minutes of presentation, but I'll be checking the board regularly and trying to stop and interrupt and engage with the questions that might come up. So please feel free to use the back channel, and Matthew as well, as if you want to type in, that'd be great to give feedback to people as we go along. So I might lose the video in a second. I'll go to the slides. I'm very interested to talk to people at the end, and certainly to make contacts with people nationally and internationally who are interested in this assessment and self-peer assessment, as I am. So I'll lose this video now and go on to my slides. Matthew, can you confirm the video's off?
Yep, no more video now. Do you remember how to move the slides forward? Yep, okay, there we go. Super.
I'll just get organised. Great. So what I'm going to talk about today is the relationship of self-assessment to reflective practice and how it's supportive. I'm briefly going to describe my study and then talk about the two parts of the study with the focus on the quantitative elements of my study, but I promise not to get too ridiculously caught up in p-values and t-values. It's very descriptive statistics, and there's a lot of graphs that will help make things visual and immediately graspable. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the qualitative feedback that I got from student participants, and then finally to run an open discussion at the end. So, are my slides showing up okay, everybody? Matthew?
Yes, all good.
Good. All right, so I'd like to start with a quote from Dr Mathew about self-assessment. And you can see, if you can read it, that they put self-assessment very much as a construct and a practice inside formal assessment. But of course, self-assessment is also really the practice of individuals. So that while self-assessment practice is often situated in a formal assessment context, you know, when we get students to formally self-assess the quality of their work, in a sense, what we are doing is we're modeling a very important reflective practice. And so the things that we do in assessment to help students do self-assessment better with more rigor and more realistic self-assessments, I think a large part of that is to encourage them to take that practice away into their individual practice. So self-assessment, therefore, is often seen as part of a suite of personal reflective practices. And some of the other ways that reflective practices are operationalized or practiced are things like peer assessments and 360-degree feedbacks, people writing diaries or journals or reflective pieces, or keeping portfolios. But it seems to me that the particular advantage of self-assessment is that it's a very light and bright form of reflective practice, and that people can do it easily and quickly at any time. So they don't need complicated mechanisms or effortful approaches. Now, one of the great problems, of course, with self-assessment, however, is that people find it, because it's not referencing constructs or giving the feedback of others, is it can be quite inaccurate. And when self-assessment is inaccurate, then it's not adding much benefit to the person doing the self-assessment. However, it's been a talking point for a long time in education about how we do develop independent judgments of students. And certainly there's a big movement that directive approaches, like exams, for example, are very, very poor ways to help students develop judgment. And so there's been a big move towards getting assessment to try and do double duty by engaging students in the process of assessment and getting them to develop their critical and constructive and reflective skills as a natural part of assessment. And of course, self-assessment fulfills this brief brilliantly, I think, when self-assessment activity is well supported and well designed and students are trained in doing it. And so our university, University of New South Wales, we recently highlighted the role of self and peer assessment as a systemic expectation in much of our assessment activity. So we can across many instances in many courses get students engaged in assessment activity and get them to analyse and reflect and develop their judgment processes. And so when I go on a little bit to describe my task design in terms of how we supported students, basically we went through cycles that mirrored Zimmerman and Moylan self-reflection cycle, and we used that in a self-assessment setting. So we did a lot of work on task analysis and criteria analysis and getting them to engage their beliefs about their ability to be self-assessors. In the performance phase, we got them to try and attend to feedback and to think about how they were processing their accuracy in relation to criteria-based estimates and feedback. And we asked them to then consider if they needed to calibrate their judgments before they did a second self-assessment. So in terms of how we designed the support and training of students to be more accurate self-assessors, we have a theory background and model to work with. So in terms of the big picture with self-assessment, a lot of people have really, I guess, dissed or dismissed the point of doing self-assessment because of the long-term observations of the relative inaccuracy of students and their tendency to overestimate and all the psychological confounds that lead and encourage overassessment, for example. However, the contrary argument is that the practice of self-assessment has got a great deal of utility in that it's a way for students to, if they can develop reasonable reliability, to get quick feedback that they can use on the go. And certainly in professional contexts, this has really been something of a holy grail for people interested in self-assessment, to increase the reliability and the agreement of novice learner judgments with those of experts, so that when professionals become independent, they can trust their judgment and feel that their self-judgments are valid and that can have a role in informing their professional practice. So if you imagine, for example, engineers and medical students and high stakeholder type professions, it's extremely important to have a monitor. In fact, I think for all professionals, it's extremely important to have a self-monitor that tells you that you can flexibly and frequently use to tell you if you're moving outside the scope of your area of expertise, you need feedback from others, you need to stop and check. I think the very act of embedding a predisposition towards self-assessment is very good for that very reason, in that it gets people to do continuous monitoring and reference to their understanding of quality. So, in relation to my study, I've been doing a thesis for a few years. It's ethics approved. I did a mixed methods study on self-assessment, actually a quantitative study, and it was self-assessment on criteria with an accuracy focus. So, in relation to why criteria-based self-assessment, a lot of the literature suggests that holistic self-assessments are particularly inaccurate, and criteria-based assessments offer better hope for people to make more granular and more realistic judgments. So another good thing about criteria is they describe to students what expert judges value. So in a large task for novice learners, criteria can segment the task into comprehensible performance targets against which they can perform and do self-judgments. Criteria also interact well with rubrics, and this is a step towards establishing people building up hierarchies of understanding of what quality work is in their discipline area. And further, it provided a framework for marking and feedback, and a great step on the calibration process. So my research proposal was a broadly descriptive one to observe self-assessment, practice and accuracy in 2 tasks and 2 courses. And I wanted to represent what was the general presentation of self-assessment, accuracy, and did students who were initially accurate readily improve their accuracy on the second task after feedback. Also wanted to look at the mechanisms by which they improved, and also any other observations that I could make from this study. Again, another conceptual model that informed what I was going to do, and this is from Sargent, is looking at the main steps in the process of a self-assessment cycle, right from the area of domain expertise and training through the practice and calibration, on to improving monitoring and performance that may potentially lead to improved expectation. In this talk, I'm going to mostly be talking about these areas: the practice of self-assessment, what I observed, and how students calibrated their self-assessment accuracy. So, so to collect the data, we used software that's used in several faculties at University of New South Wales. It's called Review. It was developed at UTS, University of Technology, Sydney, one of our frenemies in the neighbourhood. And this software permits academics to create a task with criteria and to mark against particular criteria, but also to allow students to do self-assessment. And this display of the gap or the difference between a staff mark and a student self-assessment on particular criteria gives the students visual feedback, as well as can be accompanied by textual feedback, about their level of performance and what they have to do to improve. So typically what we see is, to some extent, a gap. If the student's very accurate, the gap is quite small. Behind each pointer there's a number. In our system, a mid-credit is like a mark of 78. Here, student predicted they'd get a low distinction, so 86. So the marks gap is about 8 marks out of 100. It's a 0 to 100 scale: fail, pass, credit, distinction, high distinction. So the size of the gap gives a lot of information to the student, as well as the direction. If the student thought they'd get a pass in this case, they'd be underestimating. Here, they've overestimated. And not only the direction, but the size of the difference gives the student a lot of information. So I compared 2 tasks, as I said before. Self-assessment was optional, but participation was high. They did 2 types of essay tasks in each course. The criteria were very, very similar between the 2 tasks, and we supported both marking staff and the students with training around interpretation and a joint understanding of the criteria. So there was a lot of support for their practice. Now, when we got the data back, so for example, a student might have thought they were going to get a mark of 85 on a particular criteria, but the academic gave them 72. In that case, their difference mark would have been more than 10 marks above the academic, so they over-assessed, and in fact they were strong over-assessors. So students whose predictions were within 5 plus or minus were regarded as accurate assessors, and then students who predicted that they'd get less marks than the academics, that was a relatively small group, these are under-assessors or strong over-assessors. You can see that the marks differences exist on the column for over-assessors, accurate assessors, and under-assessors. Let's get a bit of feedback. Can everybody hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up or Matthew? Matthew? Oh,
yep. People are typing into the box. I'm sure if you can see the box.
Good. Sometimes you just wonder if, I should ask.
Yeah, you're not talking to a brick wall. We're all here.
Thank you. So, in terms of supporting students, before they did self-assessment on the first task, we provided them with pre-task training. After the first task, we gave them accuracy feedback and feedback on their performance and task. Before the second task, they received more training. Again, similar task and criteria. Again, we gave them accuracy feedback.
Yes. Joanna just asked, what are the tasks themselves? For example, were they substantive essays or presentations as tests? You didn't mention essays, but what percentage were they worth, for example?
Yes, they were reasonably substantive tasks. So they were kind of like the first task was like 10%, the second one was 25, 30. In one of the two courses, they were case studies, and then in the other course, it was a report, a kind of a management report or something. But pretty familiar task types. In terms of the percentage of the uptake, it was optional, but we got between 60 and 90% of the students in a very large enrollment course to do the self-assessment activity. So they're the demographics, 130 and 170 students. The main difference was the first year and the second year course. The second year course had a lot more local students in it. A lot more local students. The first year course was a lot more international students. And the second year course, some of them had done some self-assessment before. And this actually really strongly affected accuracy. They were all pretty much young as well. So the self-assessment percentage uptake was reasonably high, especially in the management group. So although it was optional, we did it. And also a lot of people gave us quantitative feedback at the end. So we had quite good sample sizes. They were about 90 and 120 were the students who did self-assessment in both the tasks. Now, just in case anybody is getting bored or they have to run off, what I'm actually going to do is summarize the findings really briefly in this slide and then go through some of this detail. So, consistent with a lot of other studies, students tended to over-assess at pretty high levels. Under-assessment was really quite limited. From the first task to second task, the self-assessment accuracy of the whole cohort generally did improve. I think we really assisted that with the level of support and training we provided. Accuracy particularly improved for the very inaccurate students. So students who really strongly over-assessed or under-assessed, in general, they improved their accuracy a lot. Which sounds like common sense, but basically we gave them a big signal, and they were the ones who could most easily calibrate. The accurate assessors wobbled a lot. So people who are already accurate, there's not much room for them to become more accurate. So only quite a few of them stayed reasonably accurate, but quite a few of them also went up a bit. But students who became less accurate by a small amount, whereas the students who tended to become more accurate actually got a lot more accurate, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yes, strangely enough.
Excellent. Good. Well, then, this might get a pass. The second years were more accurate than the first years, which is kind of consistent with several other bits of research and kind of intuitively sensible as well, because they've got several years of calibrating feedback already and earned grade history. The nice thing for a study on criteria-based accuracy is students made improvements in their self-assessment accuracy on the criteria that they were very inaccurate on in the first task. So I was a bit surprised. I thought that the students maybe would be very monotone and say on each criteria, I'm very good, I'm very good, I'm very good, I'm very good. But they actually most students tended to overrate themselves strongly on one or two criteria. And in the second task, they appeared to really attend to both the feedback of that inaccuracy and become more accurate, but also to score more task marks on those criteria where they got low marks in the first task. So we saw a lot of relationship between accuracy and task mark outcomes. We also found that local students were a lot more accurate than internationals, and probably unsurprisingly, males tended to rate themselves and make higher self-marking than females. Anyone surprised by that? I might get a bit of reaction on it. Oh, you shouldn't be surprised. Did the students have the criteria prior to the task? Yes. Yes. And so in class we had 20 minutes of training where we analysed what the criteria meant and how they related to the lyrics. Did the students understand the criteria more the second time around? Possibly, but that didn't really come out in my quantitative questioning, so that would be a good research surprise. Yes, and I agree, not really surprising, but good evidence of it. What was the incentive structure to get the accuracy right? There's no overt incentive structure. It was really the incentive structure that we put forward was that we thought it would help them perform better. So that was the only incentive offered to help them be accurate. So that's okay. That's a quick summary of my findings. What I might do now is to go into some of the detail of the study. So, do students tend to over-assess? Well, look at the under-assessment column. This is percentage. Very low percentages of students under-assess. The second years were more likely to under-assess than the first years. In terms of over-assessment, the novice first years were observed to over-assess at much higher rates, but in both courses, over-assessment reduced from task 1 to task 2 quite markedly. And the percentage of students who are in the accurate range of 5 marks either side of agreement with the marker increased quite nicely. So there was a general movement towards accuracy. In terms of broad observation of mark associations with self-assessment accuracy, the sample sizes are quite good, and this graph is repeated in all cases. And basically red is the self-assessment average of the strongly over-assessing students through to the strongly under-assessing students. And in this group, there were a lot of students, and it's not a statistical blip. They were estimating that they would get 78 marks, but they got 62. Accurate students, of course, were about right. Under-assessors were predicting that they would score 67. They scored 74. And this inverse relationship of high marks to very modest self-predictions is in line with a lot of other research, but it was absolutely consistent across the 4 tasks. This is a nice example, but there was always this inverse relationship. Really, especially in the first task, really strongly over-optimistic, ill-informed self-assessment by a large number of students. I'm just reading the comments. Joe, yes, yes, that's a possibility. But also, I think another element of it is just calibrating uninformed ideas about their performance level. So the second years, for example, this is from, oh no, this is the second year. Even they were very unrealistic about the quality of their work, and I think that's what it mainly goes back to. Ferreira, sorry, I don't know your first name, but no, we told them quite explicitly, and I think they understood it, that the academics, the markers, couldn't see their self-assessment until after the marking process was completed. So we told them that several times in several ways, at lectures, by email, and in the system. So I'm just going to press on a little bit. So in this particular graph here, we have the over-assessors. It's a little bit busy. The blue line is the over-assessors task 1 difference score. There's about 60 students here, and in task 1, this student predicted that they would get a mark about 30 marks higher than they got. The red squares are their different scores from agreement with the marker in task 2. And the green area is kind of accurate range from -5 to 5 away from the marker. So in task 1, the students on the right side, who were very over-optimistic and over-assessed very strongly, more than 10 marks, almost all of them in task 2 calibrated to being more accurate. So they maybe didn't become completely accurate, but they all got better. And this I saw as symptomatic of the strength of the signal of inaccuracy that they received through the self-assessment process. On the left side, these students who were mildly over-optimistic, a lot of them improved, but some of them drifted a little bit higher. And this is pretty common, I think, when you're looking at large populations of their self-assessment practice. Not everybody will improve. But on the right-hand side, I thought this was particularly striking, that students who were strongly over-assessing on the first task really paid attention to the degree and direction of their accuracy and responded with more accurate self-assessment. So what do people think about that graph? Have you ever seen anything like that before? I'll press on to the next one, see while there's any reaction. Next one's a bit similar. It's under-assessors. And the under-assessors show a similar thing. So perhaps I didn't explain this clearly before. This is an individual student. So this student, on the first task, task 1, really strongly underestimated. It's the same person here, and this one matches to this one. So these students who underestimated, again, as a group, nearly all of them calibrated to more realistic self-assessment, just like the over-assessors did in general, especially the strong ones. So what we see here is, I think, a really strong response in the task 2 scores. Okay, we'll go back to that. I think a really strong response to, so somebody said that they thought there was a little rough dyslexic. The lack of a trend in task 2 scores confused me. So once again, this is lined up as individuals. So this individual task 1 is this person on task 2. This person on task 1 is this person on task 2. And this person on task 1 is this person on task 2. And I don't think you can expect a perfect trend or a... Oh, I see. You can't see my cursor. Oh, I'm sorry. That's tricky. Matthew, is there any way for me to...
Yeah, you can use a little laser or an arrow. So I'm not sure if you can see the toolbar, but there's a little pointer thing that does...
Which one?
Yeah. Oh, the laser pointer will do. You can put little dots, stars on there. You see that?
Okay. All right. So I guess what I was trying to say is this student here lined up with this student here, and so on. So this student here is this student here perhaps, and so on. So I don't think you can expect a perfect trend, but a lot of the students from task 1 got better on task 2, especially those who were strong overestimators.
What I see from these charts, sorry to interrupt, is those people at the extreme ends on task 1, people tended to come towards the middle a bit more on the second task. There's less extremeness, if you will.
Absolutely.
Both sides of the scale. Would that be inaccurate?
No, that's perfectly accurate, and that's also reflected in the under-assessors as well. So when they were getting the visual feedback in the review interface, they not only got their own personal feedback of inaccuracy, they also could see what the average mark for the whole cohort was. And I think that gave them a sense of whether they were being really hard on themselves and helped them to reflect on the quality of their work in relation to the marking standards. To answer my own question, I think not. Tim, sorry, what are you after? I'm not sure. 2 scores with independent random values. Well, you want to give me a bit more context on that and I'll try and answer. I'll just press on for the moment. So when we look at criteria level assessment, and this particular view is a mean score of the under-assessing students, but it actually does relate to individuals as well. So they entered their estimates or their predictions against criteria such as critical thinking, written communication, reading or knowledge. And for the students, so blue is the students, as you can see here, one or two particular criteria, they were much more strongly over-assessing. So in task 1, these under-assessors got feedback from the academics and they could see a gap between their prediction and what they got. In task 2, and there's only 4 students, but it worked out pretty much the same if we look at larger samples, not only were they much more aligned, but they tended to moderate some of their high marking on particular criteria. So what that looks like, what I was kind of expecting that students would do, especially the overestimators, would say that they were really, really strong on every individual criteria. That's what I was expecting, but that actually didn't happen. Students were relatively nuanced. Again, these are mean scores, but it actually reflects what a very large number of students did. On 1 or 2 particular criteria, they were very inaccurate in the first task. And the thing that was pleasing was when I looked at the second task, these were the criteria on which the students tended to, especially if they were over-assessors, they tended to reduce their high self-marking, and they showed performance improvement on those criteria. So, the criteria that they were very inaccurate on, down here, this is the students who became more accurate, and this is the amount they became more accurate on. 5 marks, 5 to 10 marks, 10 to 15 marks, 15 to 20 marks. So in here, we've got a lot of improvement on the criteria in which students were very inaccurate on. There were other criteria where students were relatively accurate, and on those criteria, this graph was very equal, almost very equal. But on the inaccurate criteria, students made quite strong gains. But the thing was, they didn't only make accuracy gains. And so now this example here is an individual. And this guy was an over-assessor. So on task 1, he over-assessed by 10 marks. On task 2, his student estimates were nearly a perfect match with the assessor. They came much closer. So on task 1, he was really high self-marking on 2 criteria, communication and research, and others he was quite a bit lower. But in task 2, he moderated his self-marking and responded to his inaccuracy and brought his self-marking down. But the other thing that this student did, along with the other students, was he increased his marks on those criteria as well. So he not only brought down high self-marking, but he improved his performance on the marks he got on these criteria. And I took this as attention to the inaccuracy in self-assessment also translated to actioning that feedback into improving the performance. So I thought that was a really good outcome to see evidence of improved task performance associated with increased accuracy at the criteria level. The questions come in for, I agree, it's hard to know how much of the improvement is reflection of feedback, the incorporation of the feedback, because there were 2 things at play. And I think it's relatively hard in a naturalistic study to get ethics approval to do some sort of controlled condition thing where you separate the students out to try and look at those effects in detail. So just to continue on very quickly in terms of task mark performance. So this is the outcomes from the initial assessor type, from task 1 to task 2. So the students who under-assessed, and this happened in both courses, in task 2, there were small percentage marks improvements for all students. But the largest percentage marks improvements were the students who were initially over-assessors or strong over-assessors. And this was the same in both courses. Amongst the over-assessors, especially the strong over-assessors, only a very few students did not improve their self-assessment accuracy. The ones who did not improve their self-assessment accuracy did not show task mark gains. But students who improved the self-assessment accuracy, this was accompanied by better performance on the criteria that they performed poorly in, and quite strong task mark changes. In the other course, the task mark improvement change was about 5% for this group, compared to about, again, 2.5% for the overall cohort. So that was quite a pleasing outcome to see that there was a really good task mark performance gain improved with the lowest performing students from the initial task, because it's a bit of a commonplace in assessment studies that the best predictor of future performance is past performance. And so to see large task mark gains by the weakest students in the class kind of goes against the grain of a lot of stuff you see in terms of predictive assessment. I've got a couple of bit of quantitative feedback from students to go through, but are there any, maybe pause for a second to see if there's any general questions about the quantitative stuff?
Then if you scroll up a bit, there was a couple of questions on, so Fiera wanted to ask, could you try to do the same sort of study with markers, i.e. tutors as subjects? So
Absolutely.
And marking moderation approach too.
Absolutely, Fiera, because, and in fact, I've got colleagues here, Daryl Tomlin in Sydney, and at QUT, who've done that kind of thing in review. It's very well suited to that. Yeah, does that really well. Anna. Yeah, I agree, Anna. Probably second years do take this better. I think that it's never too early to start improving self-awareness in terms of analysis of personal performance against rubrics, against exemplars, and against quality standards. So I would start straight away, actually. Joe? Yeah, we're talking about pragmatic approaches to it in the business school. So yeah, we've got some interest from schools to do this through first, second, and third year. And reviewers got very good tools for visualizing student accuracy over time. So it's quite cool that way. No, that's okay. Long questions, all right? Tim? I'm not sure what your point is about over-assessors. If you can... Matthew, is there anything we haven't? Karen, yes, there was. So there's the students who improve self-assessment and success at second task, especially in relation to over-assessors, and most especially in relation to strong over-assessors. So the strong over-assessors really made big task mark improvements. So they were judged to be performing much better.
Maybe because they got a shock that they weren't doing as well as they thought they were on that criteria, and hence it sort of focused their attention on it.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, that sort of thing of the ideas of like cognitive dissonance. But I thought I was really good at that, but I see that I'm not, and I think that's for most students, they take that in a good way, and you know, they don't feel crushed. They feel, especially at business school, we've got very able students, and so you know, they generally respond pretty positively, I think. A little bit, Karen, a little bit. There was a slight underutilization of the option by the weaker students. So we've got a little bit less data on those. Teresa, I completely agree. It's a bit unfortunate. Quantitative studies are kind of quick and dirty, I think, in the area. These numbers are imprecise, and I think it's better to see these things on a continuum. I agree. Making judgments under 1% is a bit mad, in fact. And I think it's important to look at general performance in ranges, being close to accurate, rather inaccurate, very inaccurate. Okay, time's going to run away, so I might run through really quickly through the student views on the utility of self-assessment. So we did qualitative studies, so 5-point Likert scale, and 2 that are very quickly. So basically the students thought it was en masse, they thought it was very, very useful. And in the last column, I want to develop better self-assessment. You know, that was a very strong response. They thought that was a no-brainer. And developing accurate professional judgment is an important skill. Again, they thought that was really quite important. So the other things that we saw was we asked the second years if they'd ever done it before, and only a very small percentage had done a lot of self-assessment. So really it told us that by end of second year, they'd been in 8 courses, 32 tasks. For most of them, 40%, they'd said they'd done self-assessment 2 or 3 times maybe. So really, we don't have self-assessment widely embedded in our courses, and that was a bit of new information for us. Then we looked across the quantitative feedback. We banded it in terms of their general experience, self-regulation, motivation, skills development, and professional judgment, and metacognitive skills development, and did several other quantitative analysis. But I want to share a couple of the quotes that came from students. In terms of self-regulation, they said it helped them look closely at the work and figure out which parts they were good at and which needed more work. And also they used it as like a checklist to see whether they'd answered all the parts of the task well. So they used it as a kind of a checklist approach, and also focusing on where they were good and weak. In terms of recognizing standards and developing judgment, they thought that was a great idea to focus on strengths and weaknesses at that granular level. And one student, as we have a lot of international students, said, it's my first semester and this was really good because it helped me focus on what constitutes different grades. So they were quite positive in those areas. In terms of metacognition, quite a few of them talked about the levels of thinking about thinking and thinking about judgment. And so that was really gratifying to hear them talking like teachers. And this student said, doing the activity generates building block for improvement. Identification steps and elements that need improvement is undoubtedly important. And I think this kind of goes to the mindset that is the justification for self-assessment, is we're modeling practice where people try and take a framework approach, referencing to as they understand quality, going with objective viewpoint, and then reflecting on it at the end to be part of an internal dialogic cycle, which has also got external inputs. So I think the self-assessment practice is really quite useful as a model. So that is kind of where I'm summing up. Already 6:45, I think. I don't want to go on and on. But self-assessment activity, when well designed and well supported, supports many useful processes that both work inside formative assessment, but also stand as a bridge towards students embedding these practices in their personal approaches, in their personal approach to ongoing reflective practice. And really, I think it's a foundational step towards their professional practice. So what I might do is stop the formal part. I don't think there's any more slides I want to show you. I might stop the formal part of the presentation there and just chat to the chat room, and also invite Matthew to moderate as well.
Yes, folks, if you would particularly like to ask any, say, complex questions, you're welcome to put up your hand and request just the put up hand symbol, to request the microphone if you want. Tim, you might want to do that, given you had some quite complex thinking going on there.
So just while we're waiting for that, Karen, I agree. I think there's a huge crossover to self-efficacy. So the work of Bandura, for example, was very informative for me in getting this up. And a lot of people have posited a link between self-efficacy, so self-assessment judgments, as a kind of a proxy of self-efficacy judgments. And I think that's a really interesting line of research, in that people who are particularly persistently overestimating or persistently underestimating, that I think is the strongest case to make that there is a relationship there to underlying states, whether it's self-efficacy or other psychological confounds that are interfering with judgment. So I'd be interested to hear what you think about that, Karen. Teresa. Yeah, this study is kind of banded to accuracy in 5 marks, and I've done that, and it kind of comes out with the same conclusions. It's just a little bit more granular. But basically, the overestimators, the accurates, and the underestimators are all grouped in bands of 5 marks to get those groups. Maria?
Oh, right.
Yep. Agree. Ellen, I didn't really have much input to criteria that the academics wrote because I was a guest in their courses, so I could make a little bit of advice, but it was really, it was the decision of the academics about what criteria the students would perform against. Yeah, there are a couple of papers, so they're in the bibliography. I've got 2 in there. You can look them up online. Anna, thanks for that. That's really good. Joe, copy of the recording. Matthew, do you want to speak to that? Oh.
Yep. Sorry, I had my phone on already. So yes, it'll be up after the session, probably by Friday, I would say. Normally it gets up Friday. I'll send out an email link when it's ready. Anyway, so if you signed up via the Transforming Yourself website and press the tick button, say yes, you'd like to receive the newsletter, and I'll tell you what's coming out, along with the detail of the next session. So
I'm just showing the slide with the references again. Maria, that's a really short list. This is a real rich literature. So there'd be a lot more in my papers or the papers of the other people. I think, just want to mention, put a call out to all the friends over in the UK. I come over to the UK once or twice a year, so really keen to have conversations with people over there in relation to running their talks again in UK institutions. I've got a small group of people that are on my talking list, but I'm happy to discuss doing presentations, and also just keep contacts about future possible research or work. It's always very interesting to be cultivating contacts with people overseas. So a bit of call out to the people in the UK. I'd love to talk to you after, or separate to this presentation. So I'm just scrolling down to see if there's any, when do students submit their self-assessment? So they have to submit their self-assessment, Peter, before the criteria and the task is marked on the review website. So they're encouraged to do it at a midpoint of creating their work, and then to go back again after their work has been submitted through Moodle. And they do that before it's marked. So there comes a point where the self-assessment is locked and they can't keep changing it.
Karen, you've put up a virtual hand. If you'd like to press the talk button, you may speak.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Karen.
Oh, brilliant.
Where are you from?
I'm at La University. I'm
Hi.
on one of the regional campuses in Bendigo, so I'm 2 hours from Melbourne, in Victoria, Australia. Look, my question is, this seems to have got a number of really positive outcomes to it with students.
Yep.
And given your earlier comment that there was a slight tendency for weaker students not to take part in this activity, this self-assessment activity, I wonder if you ever considered, or if it were possible, to attach it to an assignment in such a way that if students didn't do the self-assessment, that they wouldn't receive a mark, so that it kind of becomes a routine aspect of submitting an assignment, is to go through the criteria and to do a self-assessment.
Yeah, we do that. We do that in some courses. I didn't do that in my study, and ethics probably would have precluded it.
Yeah.
But we use review in a lot of courses at business school, and some of them make it a requirement that the students do self-assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it becomes part of the process.
Yeah, that's right. It's becoming in some courses, it's becoming a naturalistic part of the assessment process. Let me get other examples of self-assessment tasks we can set, don't rely on review. Without software, it does become harder. I think you've got to. Otherwise, it's a manual process. It's not so pleasant. Self-assessment. Yeah, it's actually, we find it relatively lightweight in this system. It makes it very easy. Peer assessment has got more moving parts. I love peer assessment. They're related areas. Peer assessment does require a bit more work, but we've done some good things with software again as well. So, I don't know your first name, but I'll be happy to chat with you about that offline later or at the end. Oh, yeah, it'd be great. Send me an email. My email's on the first slide. So yeah, I'd love to do that. Francis, hey, how you doing? Alice, it'd be great. I mean, I'm not going to do it this year, but yeah, peer assessment, calibration, absolutely. It's a great area to study. Tim, thanks for those.
The first slide, you can see Dean's email at d.carroll@unsw.edu.au if you want to contact him.
Yeah, Karen, because we've got it embedded in a software that makes it quite easy, it really does not take much time to manage. It's really very, very easy. I think that it takes a little bit of time, but it's time well spent, is preparing students to do it properly. But this is really something that the teachers do all the time anyway. 10, 15 minutes in a class to discuss the criteria and the task, to get ready and help them focus. You know, exemplars and rubrics, these are all really good things to do. Anna, thanks. I think you might have been heading off. And Matthew's encouraging you to fill in the feedback form.
Yes, please.
Aldonio, okay. Aldonio, hey, nice to meet you. Happy to talk further. Super. Okay, Maria, we'll see you online. Okay, Bhavani, bye. See you, Karen. Software for peer assessment. Yeah, we use a couple, Peter. Review has got a peer assessment element. We've also used WebPA, which we've recently dropped, however, because we integrated it into Moodle and we somehow broke it. Spark, absolutely, Bhavani, is a very good tool. that's come from UTS as well. So UTS invented Spark and Spark Plus and Review, and they will both do peer assessment. Spark Plus is more fully featured, really quite muscular tool. It's very good for people who want to do peer assessment very thoroughly. The Review approach to peer assessment is a bit simpler, a little bit light bright. And Tim, you're right, Moodle has got a basic peer assessment tool. It's quite good for commenting on documents. The Review approach more is giving feedback about peer activity and the quality of team members' work. So we use the different tools for different purposes. Feedback form. I think the feedback form is on the website.
Yep, you can fill out the feedback form. So that little link I've been posting into the text chat is clickable. So those people who are asking for it, you may kindly fill in the feedback form via the link. Thank you.
Kathy's another one. Thank you, Bhavani. And just wanted to say, Aldonia, thanks a lot. Look forward to getting in touch. Sorry, Matthew, you're going to say?
No, we're all good. So we're going to post the text chat will appear on the recording on our recording page as well. So all these suggestions we can capture those and put them up there, and people can refer back to them later.
Yeah, I guess we'll be wrapping up in a minute or two, but I wanted to, Teresa, thank you so much. I wanted to thank everybody for sticking with me. I'm glad that most of you found it interesting. I don't think that many people fled the room, did they, Matthew?
Well, still 22 of us in the space.
It was fun for me. Thanks everybody. I don't think I answered every question, but I did try and get back to the ones that I could get to easily while I was doing the presentation on the run.
Okay, so I think we probably should wrap up the recording. So I'll just say thank you very much to Danny, and thank you very much for the folks who came. The session next week is also related to students' impressions of feedback and assessment information coming via online systems. So you might like to join us for that one as well. But thank you very much, and we'll see you again in about a month's time.
Okay, thanks everybody. Bye, and happy to stay in touch.
Bye-bye.